Hello again, everyone. In this video, we'll look at the white setups with knight f3 that aren't the classical. So that's primarily the Gligoric variation, the Petrosian, the Mechanigoff with h3, and a quick look at the exchange variation as well. And we'll check out the same-ish in the next video with f3. So I'll jump straight in with bishop e2, e5. Here, if white castles, knight c6, and bishop e3 is some Gligoric variation, but castling kingside this early is not very critical. And we can play knight g4. And we should transpose into the main Gligoric with bishop e3. Now here, you should be careful. Playing on autopilot, as we do against castle, is not too recommended. If we go knight c6, d5, knight e7, white doesn't have to simply transpose with castle kingside. Instead can play knight d2, which is really annoying. This is a sort of perfect setup for white. All the pieces are doing a good job. And he's ready to play g4, exploiting the fact he's not castled kingside to control the f5 square. If we can't break with f5, it becomes very difficult for us to generate any counterplay. We're quite passive here. So try and remember to avoid this. You could play knight bd7 if you are happy with the classical knight bd7 lines that we looked at first. And this is just going to transpose. But to keep it independent, let's look at knight g4. Now white hits our queen, f6, and now white has a choice. h4 these days is the main move, as bishop c1 has been diffused rather. Finally, d2 is just not a good square. It gets in the way of the queen, defending the d4 pawn, and we can exploit it immediately with the exchange in f5, attacking this knight. White can take on g4. When our structure looks a little ugly, but actually it's quite useful, because it's going to be difficult to defend the e4 pawn long term. White might need f3, but after f3 gf, white doesn't have a good way to recapture, and it'll be white with the bad structure. Example, bishop e3, knight c6. And if white exchanges, we've also got play down the b file. I've got good play with our bishop pair. The one thing to remember is that after bishop d4, let's maintain the bishops with bishop h6. Then we're threatening c5 and damaging white's structure. So d2 is not a good move. c1 used to be fashionable, but got diffused. Knight c6. And d5 is the main move. We should pay special attention to castle kingside, which was Sam Shankland's recommendation in his chessable course. Now, in general, it's a good course, but he was very disparaging about the King's Indian, saying that there are lots of different ways that white can be better. It's strange then that the choice that he made is definitely not better for white. It gives us very comfortable play. And all I can say is that I'm regretting my choice of playing the Grunfeld when I played him, and it'll have to be the King's Indian next time. We play in the center with f5. Now, the only logical way for white to continue is keeping the center fluid. If he closes it with d5, we just have a very good version of the classical lines. We've gained time. We've already got in f5. So white has to try and claim our position is a bit loose. For example, the most common is bishop g5 and here d5, but this is just very good for us. We can make use of this new square. Now knight is ready to come to f7, and we're just so far ahead compared to a normal Mar del Plata variation line. Likewise, d5 here is not good. We can hop into d4, and we actually transpose to the main line, which is very good for us these days, or at least full compensation. White has stopped playing it. So Shankland's recommendation is to take. We recapture with a piece. In this variation, we would like to keep knight and bishop on e5 and f5 if possible. So we're intending on recapturing with ef with bishop takes f5. Example, ef bishop takes. And now we've got a very good pair of bishops and a nice central square for our knight. Sam's line continues, bishop e3, knight g4, check, just sidestep. And we move out with our queen being attacked and complete our development with rook a e8. Sam leaves it here and gives white a structural advantage, but I don't really see it. I think all we need to worry about is giving white enough time to play queen d2 and knight d5, when he might have an edge with a good knight. But there's a couple of different ways against that. Rook e8 was what was played against him by Gligoric in a blitz game that worked extremely well. And knight f6 with the idea of queen back, knight e4 also works very well. We exchange off the pair of knights and prevent the whole plan of knight d5. And we also have an interesting idea of sacrificing the exchange by taking twice on f3. Rook takes, and then knight e5, queen h3. White has a very weak king. f3 is a great square for our knight. But rook e8 also worked well. So the main move was d5 here. When the pawn sacrifice, knight d4 has closed this line as a try for an advantage for white. It takes, and here white shouldn't take immediately. In the more or less stem game in the line, Ewen Ami against Nisipianu, the very solid and theoretician grandmaster Ewen Ami, long-term second of Anishkiri, took this pawn, but got into a lot of trouble. With f5, the queen's attacked. With hindsight, it probably should go back to d2, but play is similar. He went to d1. I'd take on e4. He grabbed the knight. Maybe better to take on e4, but queen e7 is a lot of pressure. The knight can't move because the knight takes f2, and so white has big problems down both e and f files. And bishop takes g4. White is temporarily a piece up, but queen h4 attacks the bishop and mate on f2. The only way to deal with both threats is to drop the bishop back. But now bishop takes c3 was very precise, taking it at this point, and then after b takes, check, and bishop g4, white has some big problems with this pin. e3 check is a threat when king d3 is the only way to hold on to the bishop. When bishop f5 check forces the king forward again to d4, and queen f4 is mate. Ewen tried a creative approach with c5 to try and run his king via c4 to safety, but now rook f5 highlighted the downside that rook takes d5 check is rather a big threat. After c4, we can win back a rook with the exchange, check, and take the rook in the corner. So taking the pawn immediately is not good. It's better to try knight b5 and take it with the knight, but we're quick again with f5. We activate a bishop, and knight takes f2, followed by f takes e4 and d3 is a big, big threat the white needs to react to. So he normally castles. We drop our knight back. Now we're trying to take the pawn on e4. So white takes, and now the important move to remember in the line, not simply take the pawn on f5. When knight takes d4 gives white good chances to be a pawn up. He's got a solid position. He's ready to play bishop e3. But instead, d3. Forcing white to give up the light square bishop. He has to take. And now we gain a tempo, developing our bishop. We've got two very strong bishops and a nice lead in development. Particularly the dark square bishop is doing a good job. And we have full compensation here for the pawn. So bishop c1 is not particularly impressive. And therefore, white normally tries bishop h4. When we develop our knight, we no longer need to worry about these knight d2 things. He's not getting that bind. And white has to decide whether to close the center. If he castles kingside, he's forcing us into a different Gligoric variation than the one I was intending. But the big advantage is that white has castled kingside. In this structure, I think the scary idea is white going for some h4, keeping his king in the center and trying to attack us. But now he's committed to castling kingside. It's not a worry. We're threatening now to take on d4 and play f5. So white should react, take twice, and f5 is strong. If d5, knight e7 is a position that's very easy for us to play, I think. We'll get ready to play knight g6 and f5 and maybe land the knight in on f4. The bishop is rather misplaced on g3. If it's taken, we're probably playing e takes and opening up the long diagonal for the bishop. So white normally takes. And here's another key point. We can recapture f takes. Normally this is too risky when the king is still in the center for white, but now he's committed to castle kingside. We can play this more ambitious recapture. Normally in this main line, white black is obliged to play d takes e5 against white's try. But here, f takes. Now, white has a bit of a long-term problem with this bishop on g3 being rather short on squares. The idea is to play g4 when white will have to make some big concession to get that bishop out. So white normally tries h3, but it's not particularly impressive. We can play g4 anyway. And our idea is simply to take on f3 and land the knight in on d4, when this bishop is still misplaced on g3, and we're very active. We've got a nice outpost on d4. So castle kingside. In general, I don't think it's a good combination for white to play the Gligoric variation and castle kingside. d5 is the main move. Here, knight d4 doesn't work because the bishop is better placed on h4. It's stopping us playing f5 is a key idea. And our knight is also hanging on g4 because we don't have any of the f5 tricks. So we just drop back. And white's by far the main move is to attack our knight with knight d2, trying to create that kind of bind setup that I mentioned at the start. A different approach would be h3 and g4. We'll see more of this later in the Petrosian, where white plays a quick d5, and the Mechanogov, where white starts with h3 instead of bishop e2. Both of those have this kind of setup. Now, I mentioned this was risky for us at the start if white can put its piece on the ideal squares, but here the bishop is misplaced on h4, and the knight isn't great on f3 here either. With knight f7, I don't want to play f5 anymore because I'm a bit scared about opening the g-file when it's white attacking. So we're going to change strategy, and we're going to try and find counterplay on the queen side. For example, knight d2, bishop d7. And the engine gives white some small advantage, but tellingly, no strong white players, or no white players, in fact, wanted to go anywhere near this in correspondence. The problem is, where's his king going? It's not going to go kingside after he's gone g4, and going queenside is going to run into a6, rook b8, and b5 with quick play over on the queen side. I think it's very difficult for white to maintain any kind of control here. And I think it's just too risky for him. We'll move the c-pawn to either c6 or c5, depending on exact circumstances, so that our queen joins the attack. Castle would just transpose to the earlier castle. We've covered this position already. I said I thought we were doing very well. So knight d2 is the main move. And here, there's a few choices. You can go h5 to maintain the knight, or knight back to h6. I'm going to recommend a forcing line with f5. Now, the only critical move is to damage our structure by taking this. If white simply castles, then we get a very good version of the Mar del Plata classical lines with bishop f6. As I mentioned there, in general, we're very happy to exchange off these dark square bishops. And here we're just a long way ahead of normal. We've already got our break in. White's nowhere to be seen on the queen side, so we have a very good version. I could try and keep the bishop, but here we can just slow up his play with b6. If white takes on g4, we're going to follow up by recapturing an h5, h4. Otherwise, we'll go h5, h4 anyway. It's difficult for white to find a plan. So white should take. We recapture. And now a very important move for white. Not the automatic castle. Because after bishop h6, suddenly he's got some big problem with this bishop on h4. For example, b4 would be a natural move, but we hit the bishop back. He gets in his c5 break. But without a light square bishop, it's not so useful anyway. And now we're ready just to play h5, h4, trapping that bishop. So white's going to have to weaken his king side for that bishop to escape. So he should get the bishop out while he can with bishop g5. Now, a few years ago, I saw the beautiful concept of rook f4. It's a really nice looking exchange sacrifice. In return for the exchange, we open up the long diagonal for our bishop. We've got an outpost on e5. We've got big pawn mass attacking. But unfortunately, white doesn't actually have to take it. And so it's a bit of an empty move. So we'll just play h6 instead, force the bishop back. And now c5. Once again, this concept of blocking up the queen side against that bishop on e3. And white has a big choice to make. Does he en passant or does he leave the rigid structure? En passant was Fabiano Caruana's choice against Timur Rajabov in the top match in this line. Recapture. Now, if white plays a pass move, we'll play a5, taking control of the b4 square, and then bishop e6 and d5 will break and will be perfectly fine. So Fabiano went b4. We've seen this fight before. It's all about the d5 square. Fabiano wants to play b5 and get rid of our c-pawn and try and create d5 as a nice outpost. So let's go for it with d5. Bishop e6 is a quieter alternative, but we'll follow Timur for a while. Exchange. Fabiano went for the maximum with bishop c5. Swapping on d5 is nothing for us to worry about. e4, another good move. And we have a very sharp position. Fabiano chose to take on e7. After queen takes, knight takes e5, queen f7. We threaten mate on f2. So obviously white has to react, and then we'll take the rook on a1. And seems that matters are more or less balanced. It'll be knight and 2 pawns for the rook. Alternatively, white could wait here with something like rook c1, but then e3 becomes an important idea. White can't take with the bishop because d4 forks bishop and knight. When he takes with the pawn, his king is stuck in the center, as our rook on f8 is stopping him castling. And so we have very good counterplay. We'll then play a5 to loosen up white's position further. But this is probably the critical line in the Gligoric. Instead, white could wait as well with rook b1. He's getting ready to open up the queen side. But we're just going to make sure we keep this pawn on c5. We play g5, and our plan is to bring this knight around to f4, and then we'll push the h-pawn. Ideas of h3 to force white to play g3, and then some pressure down the f-file, and also white's king is somewhat vulnerable, maybe even knight g2, get rid of that bishop. There's a nice trick that you should be aware of if you look at the full theory. The white's most natural plan is playing b4, exchange on c5, and then queen a4 into c6, attacking our rook on a8 and the pawn on d6 once our knight is on f4. Looks like it's completely winning, but actually we can play bishop d7, defending the rook, losing the pawn on d6, but when he takes on d6, rook f6, he takes on c5 and bishop f8, and the queen is actually trapped. So white's most logical looking plan here doesn't work. It just ends up with his queen being trapped. And so I don't think he can make progress. That's the Gligoric variation. The other main line here is to play d5 and play the Petrosian. Now, logically, it feels a bit strange, d5, so I'll try and explain. If we compare it with the main line, where white castled knight c6, he gained a tempo with v5 and forced our knight to e7. It's not clear that our knight is really that much worse on b8 than e7, because we can go and sit on c5. So with d5, white needs to be playing quite differently. He's delaying castle for a good reason. He's got two different ideas, but it all boils down to the same thing. He wants to stop us playing f5. He'll do that either by playing bishop g5 and pinning us, or by playing h3 and g4, although the h3, g4 line is more often reached via an immediate h3. There are a lot of transpositions here to be aware of. And luckily, we can play the same setup against both. Now, the big downside to pushing the pawn immediately, as we saw in the knight b7 lines, is the c5 square. And so we can go for that with a5. We're just carving out the c5 square. The knight's going to hop in there soon. And white has a few different ways of playing, but it doesn't change so much. Castle has been played over 2,000 times, but it doesn't really make any sense of white's position. After knight a6, we could also go via d7, and we're very likely to transpose directly into the classical knight b7 lines. But a6 is a bit more flexible because we're not blocking the bishop on c8. And we're just ready for the knight to land in on c5 after queen c2, knight c5, or knight d2, knight c5. And they're both transposed directly into the classical knight b7 lines. Bishop g5 would be white's other approach, but it's not very scary. After h6, white has to decide what he's doing with this bishop. Giving up the dark square bishop is always a mistake. We'll just take with the queen, drop the queen back, and play f5. White's got absolutely nothing in return for that bishop. If he drops back to e3, we can go after it again, and we're getting in f5. Or we can start with knight c5 and then play f5. In both, we've got very pleasant position already. Our kingside attack is coming nice and quickly. So castle is just a bad move, although it's a very common one. White should be playing rather differently. One unusual plan is to play knight back to d2 and now to go for it with h4. But we shouldn't be too concerned. This Harry the h-pawn moving in the opening is cropping up more and more these days, but this one is not particularly scary. Another move just to bear in mind is knight b3 is not working. The idea makes sense. He attacks our pawn on a5, and if we are going knight c5, we're going to damage our structure because knight takes c5 dc, and we always want to recapture towards the center if possible. But there's a downside tactically. We can just attack it with a4. If white takes, he loses his e-pawn, which is a disaster for him because we have an extra central pawn, it starts pushing, and a bishop on g7 becomes a monster. So then I would have to retreat, and then we jump into c5 anyway. White's just lost a couple of tempi. Stage 4 is a more aggressive plan. Now, I don't want to play h5. It might be possible, it might stay equal, but I think this is what white is hoping for. The issue is that with h4, h5 included, we lose a lot of control of the g5 square, and it becomes harder to play f5. White will stick a knight in on g5, and things are a bit uncomfortable. I'm also worried long term that white might still end up breaking over on the king side with f3 and g4. So we'll allow the pawn one square. But here, I think we should stop it going any further. Alpha 0 has shown the power of the pawn running the whole way to h6 than just some long-term play. It used to be considered that pushing the pawn to h5, the sole idea was to take on g6 and mate down the h-file. But here, h6 is probably a more serious threat. So we'll stop it with a surprising h6 ourselves. Now, after hg, fg, we get good play down the f-file, and we start getting some squares. We're actually happy to sacrifice the pawn on h6. In return, we'll control the dark squares, and it'll transpire that white is one with a weaker king, as is often the case when white pushes his pawns on the king side. So that is this unusual plan, but the main idea is to play bishop g5. This is a pure Petrosian strategy. White pins us, and after h6, he maintains the pin. We'll also check bishop e3, which was Kramnik's stunning new idea that worked very well as a one-off surprise weapon, but shouldn't trouble us long term once we know what we're doing. So the point of having bishop on h4 is just that it's harder for us to break with f5 now. We need to get the queen out of the way, then the knight out of the way, and even then when we play f5, we've got to watch out. He'll take it, g takes, and sometimes a bishop h5 is annoying. So we should adjust our plan. So we play knight a6, white tends to drop back, just keeping an eye on the e4 pawn. And here I want to start with bishop d7. Queen e8 is the main line, but I'm maintaining the pin for now because we've got a sneaky idea. If white tries a3 to push and reach the tabia, then queen e8 threatens a4. So white is forced to play b3, but that loosens the long diagonal and allows us a nice threat with knight takes e4. I have to take f5. We're not only attacking that knight, but also threatening g5 and f4, trapping the bishop. All we need to make sure, though, when we play these lines is that we don't allow white knight maintained on e4, dominating our bishop on g7. So here our plan is probably to be simply to get rid of this knight. By taking on e4, white can't actually, at the moment, recapture because rook f4 is very annoying, forking bishop and knight. And otherwise, we're going to go knight c5. We don't mind damaging our structure like that if we can play e4 and get our mammoth bishop on g7 into the game. Number f3, swap, bishop f5, preparing to get rid of this knight. Again, we're threatening to take and play rook f4. If white defends it, now we can play knight c5. We're threatening again to take on e4 and not allowing white to maintain a piece there. We can also activate this bishop on g7 after an exchange on e4 with h5 and bishop h6. So castle kingside is the main move, and knight c5. And white normally plays b3. He's trying to play a3 and b4 and push us back. Now the tabia would be us playing queen e8 to get the knight out of the way, and we get f3, or a3, sorry, knight h7, f3, h5, bishop f2, bishop h6. And the line is probably fine for us, but it's what white is hoping for. And it's a very strategic fight. We've got to be accurate, not to start to get steamrolled on the queen side with a3 and b4 pushing us backwards. It's hard for us to get our f5 break. It doesn't work quite as well as we want it to here. But we have a nice additional plan. And that's now exploiting the fact that the knight is undefended on c3. By the way, if you consult the main text, you'll see that white doesn't have any good move orders to transpose into the tabia. I've checked them all, and they all have downsides. This one, we can exploit the fact that the knight is hanging to sacrifice our queen with knight takes e4. Now the queen needs to be taken, otherwise we're just winning a pawn, and our uncontested dark square bishop is coming to life. So he takes our queen, we take. White has to move the queen, take on c7. Material is equal after we take on d1, but rook a6 at the end, and the bishop is going to be very short on squares on c7. So the queen moves and take. And this queen sacrifice really excites me. I think I'm a bit biased. I love sacrificing my queen. But here we have bishop and knight and pawn for the queen. So if you count the traditional counting, it's 9 points for a queen, bishop and knight and pawn adds to 7. So it's the same as an exchange sacrifice. The same 2. But in return, we've got a beautiful structure. We've got this uncontested bishop that's about to come to life with e4, a straightforward plan of pushing the e and f pawns. White is very passive and finds it very difficult to actually make any moves. And I think we're just doing very well. Even the engine agrees with me here that black is doing fine. This has been played by both Alexander Gligoric and Alireza Firouzja, while the stem game in this saw Kasparov on the black side. He took with the other rook, but that's not as natural, and there white is better. I think that's why people stopped examining this line and only came back to life a few years ago. It's still rare, and it's like to catch your opponent off guard, but I think it's very promising. The recent twist in the Petrosian variation was Kramnik's attempt to bring the bishop back to e3, which is very surprising, but also extremely risky, I think. The following positions are much easier for us to play. We go for it with knight g4. The point is that if we wait, white will play knight d2 and the normal Gligoric response. But we can hit the bishop again. The bishop can't go to g5 this time, so it has to retreat. And there's a choice between d2 and c1. d2 was Kramnik's choice, and therefore the move that you're likely to face, but it's been completely defanged. And so in correspondence, white is trying c1 instead. There's one key difference that after f5, white can now take on f5. You'll see that there's a problem with bishop on d2 here. And we should recapture with a pawn. The problem is that with bishop on d2, recapturing with a bishop is very strong. And after h3, sacrificing the knight in e4. It looks very dangerous, but with the bishop on c1, white's got the additional option of knight d4, which clearly wouldn't be a move if the bishop's on d2, because we could just take it. Here it looks like we must have some good discovered attack, but I couldn't find one. I think white is doing well. So sadly, we have to play a bit differently and just recapture with a pawn here, which is the normal recapture after all. The pawns are still doing fine. Probably white should play g3, playing against f4. But a4 is a really interesting idea. We're offering a pawn, but the idea is if we can get a3, we're making this knight on c3 much looser, and by extension, everything along the long diagonal. And suddenly e4 has become a really dangerous threat. Grabbing the pawn, we should check, but it's extremely risky. We push with f4. We've got lots of pleasant options, but this one, preparing just e4 and continuing to march in the center, is very promising. White's got to watch out for some knight takes f2s coming as well. For example, h3, knight takes f2 is far too dangerous. e4 is coming next. So knight back to c3 to cover the square, but we can play it anyway. Tactics work. Knight takes e4, queen e8. White regrets faffing around with that bishop rather than getting his king to safety. And White's just got some problems. The most natural knight c3 loses to the swap and take on f3, thanks to the pin. And the ugly knight ed2 to keep the knight defended runs into problems with the swap and bishop d4, attacking f2, and White's in a lot of trouble. So bishop c1 is possible, but it's hardly scary. Unsurprising, really, when White has just gone bishop g5 to e3 to c1. 3 moves, put the bishop back on its starting square, while h6, knight g4, and f5 are hardly bad moves for us. So Kramnik went bishop d2, and we continue thematically with f5. White has to play h3 at this point and force us back. If he takes on f5 here, then bishop takes f5, h3, knight takes f2, as mentioned, is very strong. So the knight comes back, and now that we've retreated the knight, it's better to recapture with the pawn. Keep the e4 square firmly guarded. We'll follow the Kramnik game with queen c1, attacking the pawn on h6. We defend. We don't really want king h7 because then queen c2 is an annoying pin. White's got ideas of g4. So let's keep backing on g8. g3. If White doesn't open up the position like this, then we're just winning long term. If we're given time to play bishop f5, knight a6 to c5, then we completely dominate the board. White's pieces are super passive. So he has to play a really forcing continuation like this to justify his play. But here we play e4. Kramnik went h4 with the knight, and now e3 is an important move, keeping this bishop and queen firmly out of the game for now. F takes e is the only move, and then we take on g3. The knight hopped into g6. Nakamura successfully found all of this over the board when he was surprised by Kramnik a few years ago. But here he chose the wrong square. He went to f7, but if you're going to move the rook, then it's better to go to e8, according to modern theory. But I would go for a third option that I think is simpler for us to play, which is g2. The rook has to move, and now we grab on h3. We're offering the exchange, but in return, we've got a very strong pawn on g2. White's got some problems with his king, and we're taking the initiative. I think practically this position is very difficult for White. He's got to play extremely accurately to maintain equality. So it was an interesting one-off try. Kramnik's bishop g5 to e3, but it certainly shouldn't worry you. Prepared with this g2, bishop takes h3, I think you're already favourite. So that is the thematic approach with bishop g5. It's also possible to play bishop e3 immediately. And in this precise position, I think we should allow White his plan and play knight a6. The reason is that I don't want to go into the Gligoric battles here with bishop going around to h4 when White can still castle queenside and play h3, g4. I think this is a scarier version for us. So White is allowed his setup with knight d2. Castle transposes to a position we're very happy to see that we saw in the Petrosian. But here we play knight d7. We'll see a lot more of this in the h3 lines. We play the knight back to d7 to support a knight hop into c5. One of the knights will go there, probably the d knight, in fact, to open up the long diagonal for the bishop. And then we'll play f5. And we get counterplay this way. Now, castle is an automatic move, but not at all challenging. It's better for White to try playing against our plan. We still play knight c5, getting out of the way, and preparing f5, of course. White has managed to play h4 in one go. Normally that pawn would have been on h3 first, and then h4. But it doesn't change very much here. We're in time with our counterplay in the center. White can try f3 to maintain it, but after the swap and bishop d7, an important idea here is the sacrifice rook f4. If it's not taken, then we've got pressure on the g4 and e4 pawns, and just we plug White's attack entirely. And if he does take, then our bishop becomes a monster along the long diagonal. particularly because white has to castle queenside. Otherwise, there's no escape for his king. And so our pressure on white's queenside is extremely strong. We're also ready to open up the queenside with c6 here. So, but still, I think g4 is better. Castle doesn't put any pressure on us at all. We get an f5. The one thing to be aware of when he castles is not to rush with knight dc5 here. We didn't need it. So let's go f5 first. If we'd played the immediate knight dc5, then a3 might be a bit awkward with the threat of b4. And we can't take that twice because our rook is hanging on a8. So let's just go f5 first. After f3, we can activate with queen h4, preparing to bring the bishop into the game with bishop h6. And we can be very happy. Our pieces are nice and active. And we've got our kingside attacking chances. Finally, white could play h3, which is an odd hybrid. We could get this position by lots of move orders, but more commonly, the positions are white starting with h3, as we'll see later, and then subsequently playing bishop e2. Now, in this course, I've tried to sort it so that all the lines where white plays bishop e2 are covered via this move order to make it a bit simpler to remember. Luckily, our plan remains the same against all of these setups. We start with knight a6. And now if white plays g4, we'll cover this position via the h3 move order. And here we'll just look at white's alternatives. He could try bishop e3. But here I think while knight c5 is possible, we reach a main line I'm trying to avoid after knight d2. Let's go for the rarer and simpler knight h5, trying to exploit this combination of h3 and bishop e3. That the knight is ready to hop into f4. White plays g3 to stop it, but we're now in time with f5. Our play is nice and quick. After the swap, white is rather worried about us playing f4 here. Because he's played h3, he can't maintain the pawn on g3, so he has to take it. And knight has a wonderful outpost on f4. So he moves the bishop again, so it's not attacked by f4. But white's losing a lot of time. Here we're ready to play knight c5 and a knight into e4 with a very comfortable position. We also have ideas of exploiting the long diagonal again with a4, a3, and e4 with powerful play down the long diagonal. So that is the other reason, I guess, to play h3, to try bishop e3 without knight g4 bothering white, but it's not very impressive. So bishop g5 would be the Petrosian move. Now I think we'll get out of the pin. Trying to transpose with h6 doesn't work so well, because after bishop e3, if we play exactly the same line with knight h5, unfortunately at the end of it, we don't have the h6 square for our bishop, and so our bishop remains bad on g7. So instead, let's just move the queen. We're getting ready to move the knight back to d7 and play f5. Now, there's one thing you need to be careful of here. After knight d2 is the main move. And that is not to lose the queen. I had a rather embarrassing game once where I moved the knight back, played f5, ef, gf, and after bishop h5, the queen is trapped. Here, at least, you give the rook. The version I had, I wasn't even able to give up my rook, so I had to sacrifice my entire queen. So just be careful about that one. But knight d2 is the main move, but probably more critical these days is actually g4. And this was played against me by Wei Yi, and is how they're going in high-level correspondence. I went king h8, but I don't really trust it, and it's easier anyway if we just always play knight d7 in these positions. With white's increased control over the f5 square, our plan is knight dc5 and f5. There's a funny dance that sometimes happens if white goes rook g1 to stop us playing f5. They should put the king in the corner just to get off the pin, and then we can play f5. Don't play king h8 too early, though, because while the rook is still on h1, you have to watch out for h4, h5, when we really don't want that king on h8. So only play it once white's committed to rook g1. For example, rook g1, this was traditionally the main line. We can start with knight dc5, we've got enough time. Now knight d2 here will be covered by white starting with knight d2 instead of g4. h4 would be the only challenging approach, with the rook defending the g pawn now. But now we run out of the pin at h5. We can continue with our plan of breaking with f5. Now white capturing on the pawn on f5 is not at all a worry. Either gf or ef e4. Bishops in the game. We're threatening knight d3. Got a very pleasant position. So white needs to play h6. And there's one last trick here to be aware of. White's idea is to react to gf with g5, knight h4, and g6, going for it immediately. And so we should play the accurate rook back to f8, meeting f takes g6 with queen takes g6, or knight h4 with queen e7. We're happy to sacrifice a couple pawns here just to diffuse white's initiative, and then we'll take over. If white loses this, he's going for mate. If he fails to get mate, then he's just in trouble. We've got all the long-term trumps in the position, even if we're a couple of pawns down, as our pieces enter. So this got diffused by rook f8. It was a very strong move. So white has switched to a3. Now this idea crops up in the h3 lines a lot. Our plan of bringing the knight round to c5 is key, but a3 is preventing it. The point is that if we jump in now, then b4 is annoying. And we can't take twice because our rook is hanging on a8. And therefore we need to change tack and go via b6. We're still actually probably going to end up on c5, but we're going to go via the a4 square. We're happy to exchange a pair of knights here because we've got one good square on c5 and two knights for it. So if we're allowed to exchange knights, we're very happy. Don't try the other knight to c5 with the bishop on g5 though, because knight b5 is very annoying. There's no good way of defending the pawn on c7, and you just have to drop back again. So we go knight b6. We're ready to play bishop d7 and knight a4. And it's a complicated battle, but we'll see far more of these kind of positions later in the quick starter and also in the main theory position. But the idea is bishop d7 and knight a4, either exchanging these knights or getting the knight finally to c5. So white can start with knight d2. We drop back, and again g4 is possible here, but we're in time to play knight dc5 now because white's not yet played a3, so there's no a3 b4, and we're ready to play f5 next. Rook g1, then again we should do the shuffle with king h8, again preparing f5, example knight f1, f5, and if a3, white's preparing b4, so we'll start with bishop d7, defending our rook on a8, so not allowing the b4 break. Then we can go back to playing f5, example queen c2, and here f5 is perfectly fine. But another useful rule of thumb is that we can meet queen c2 with c6, because white's not going to have a good reaction to cd5. If he recaptures cd, then b5, b4 is coming. If he recaptures ed, then f5 and e4, opening up the other bishop, is very strong. So he probably needs to take with the knight, but then we've got ideas of knight e6 and jumping into d4. With queen c2, white was preparing to castle queenside. And so clearly it's very useful to open up the queenside with c6. The one thing to be aware of with c6 and these h3 lines is don't rush with it if white hasn't played g4 yet. The reason is that once white plays g4, he's given up castling kingside, more or less. It's going to be way too risky. But if he hasn't gone g4 yet, he can always switch back to some castle kingside approach. And if that's the case, we're likely just to be creating our own weaknesses on c6, because it'll still be white attacking on the queen side. So only think about c6 once white is committed to g4, because then it's going to be white's king that's being opened up, rather than just our queen side. So white can also play a3 here, again playing against our knight dc5. But here we can just go for it immediately with f5. The main line is knight b6, but it's unnecessary. f5 is a nice shortcut. It's funny, it used to be marked as a question mark, but when I was preparing with Lila Zero, I think, for my Spanish League game, I noticed that after f6, bishop h4, f5 was the computer's top move. And this is what I played in the game. But here, white doesn't have to take, unfortunately. And my opponent played something a bit slower, and it ended up as a draw. So I think the immediate f5 is more precise because the bishop is probably misplaced on g5. Now, if f3, we're in time with bishop f6. This is a key difference with bishop on h4 versus it on g5. White would like to go back to e3, but bishop h4 check is going to be really annoying. Whereas if the bishop were on h4, then bishop f2 would keep everything under control. So white should take our offering, and now don't recapture and blunder bishop h5. Instead, the idea was to open up the long diagonal with e4. And our bishop is extremely happy, and we've got a strong initiative. The knights are ready to jump into e5 and c5 with the d3 square. So taking the pawn on e4 is critical, otherwise we'll take back. Fg, queen takes, isn't helping him either. Probably object to the f6, just giving back the pawn is best, but we have absolutely no problems. So take, we gain a tempo on the knight. Now queen is not trapped, it's got the e5 square. So the knight retreats, and we can play f4. And the bishop is a bit short on squares now, on g5. And after castle, bishop takes c3 is a nice move. We're going to follow up with queen g6. We've got a nice square on e5. We have strong play down the g file. White's king is not going to feel at all secure. Bishop takes h3 ideas are coming. And the bishop is also extremely low on squares on g5. So we have great play for the pawn. We also have another outpost on c5 to remember the knight for the other knight to hop into, and a much better structure long term. So I don't think this line is actually even playable for white anymore because of this discovery of the pawn sacrifice. So that leaves us with just the tedious exchange variation with d, e, and white should exchange queens as well. If bishop g5, we just get out of the pin. We could also play, if you want, knight bd7 to keep the queens on the board with a decent version of the knight bd7 classical. In these, the bishop isn't actually very good on g5. It looks like a tempting square, but our plan is to bring the knight around anyway. For example, c6, queen e7, knight around to e6. It's the square we want to be on because it eyes the d4 outpost and also f4. And then we gain a tempo on the bishop. So this is also good, but simply queen swap and knight a6 also works well. Just keeping an eye on the pawn on c7. So white should exchange queens and then pin us. Here, the most accurate is to just move out of the pin with rook e8. And if white doesn't play forcingly here, he can easily be worse because we have the d4 square and white doesn't have a corresponding outpost on d5. So if we're given time to play c6, knight a6, knight c5, then we're more comfortable. So white tends to exchange everything, defend the pawn. It doesn't make much logic to go dc, knight takes, and he doesn't want to be left with a weak pawn. Pushing d6 also just is liable to just lose that pawn. It's not got enough support. Exchange, and here knight d7 is the most accurate, I think. The plan is to play h6 to force the bishop away, and then knight f6. The bishop looks good on d5, but if we can attack with knight f6, then the bishop can't actually move away without dropping the pawn on e4. And if we can take on d5, we're doing fantastically. I have the bishop pair, and especially if we can play e4, those pawns start rolling, and we've got a huge bishop on g7. So white tends to defend the pawn, so he can react to a knight f6 with moving the bishop. But now we can go knight c5, and we'll put a piece, we're threatening knight d3 check, but we'll put a piece on e6, either the bishop or the knight, and we're completely fine. I think we've got the nicer side of equality here. So not super exciting, but also absolutely nothing to fear, and you can easily outplay weaker players here. So that is bishop e2 wrapped up, but h3 is the Mechanigoff system. This is very similar to the Petrosian and often overlaps when white commits to bishop e2, but there are a few plans that he can play, leaving the bishop back on f1 too. We play in exactly the same manner with e5, d5. Once again, white can play an exchange variation if he wants with de, but it's not very inspiring. He could play bishop e3 here. Maybe it's better, but we actually are just transposing to a delayed exchange here, where we don't have any problems. So white exchanges queens. This is what white does when he plays the exchange variation. Generally, it's a sign that your opponent is not very ambitious. He's getting rid of the queens. He's trying to just exchange as much as possible and He's hoping for either some small trick or some small strategic advantage, but he's very happy with the draw. But we're not going to make life so easy for him. And white tends to continue in the same way with bishop g5. Knight d5 will come to exactly the same thing with knight a6, bishop g5, rook d6. The only way to defend the knight, but perfectly adequate. Bishop d5. Now, white's kind of trick in this variation is he's hoping that we'll play exactly the same way as we did in the exchange variation with rook e8. When knight d5 swap c6, we had this position before with pawn h2 and the bishop on e2. And white there should play bishop c4. Here, he plays bishop c4 and in one go. And so he's got an extra h3. Now, I'm not sure that that really changes the assessment from equal, but white feels that he's morally gained something. So let's avoid this and instead go for the downside of h3 with knight a6. White tends to pin. The e5 pawn is almost never hanging in these exchange lines. The problem for white is if he exchanges e4 for e5, then our bishop becomes a monster on g7, and white really regrets c4. He would love to be able to put this pawn back on c3. As that's illegal, then he's going to have a very weak b2 pawn and d4 square, and our bishop just dominates. And here with the reverse rook e8, he's not going to be able to hold on to the e4 pawn. So knight d5, rook d6, takes. Now, and rook c1 is what they play. The thing is that if the bishop were back on e2 and pawn back on h2, and we tried this defense, which looks very tempting once you see this line, go, oh, I want to play it against everything. White would be able to play knight takes f6, rook takes, knight takes e5, rook e6, knight g4. When rook takes e4, which is check here, could be met by knight f6, forking king and rook. And so white can actually grab this pawn and be a bit better. So unfortunately, we can't play this way in the pure exchange variation, but it works very well here, exploiting the fact white hasn't yet developed that bishop. So white goes rook c1. If this bishop is stuck behind the pawn on c4, then white is just in trouble. Strategically, it's a very bad bishop, and it's very difficult for him to fight on the dark squares. So white's only plan is to push c5 to get this bishop involved in the game. And therefore, rook c1 is the best way to go about it. b4 is even worse. We play c6 with similar ideas. So first we play b6, taking control of the c5 square. b4. And now bishop d8 is a safe alternative when we're completely fine, but I really like c6. Now white's whole plan is to play c5, but we can sacrifice the exchange with rook takes d5, ed, e4. The knight has to retreat and cd. We've sacrificed the exchange for a pawn, but we've got a monster bishop once again and a big center. And white has some problems with these queenside pawns. We're extremely active, and it also takes white another few tempi to develop. It's a nice punishment for this h3 move. White would really rather have bishop e2 here so he could get his king to safety. And I think we're doing very well here. It's a very difficult position to play for white. So DE, this version of the exchange, I think we should be quite happy to see, because white is showing no ambition, but also we've got a great idea to mix it up. So d5 is normal. We're threatening ed4 now. As I mentioned in the knight bd7 classical lines, you don't want to mix h3 with f3, and therefore, once white has played h3, ed becomes a big threat. So d5, and we play exactly the same way as the Petrosian with a5. Now, as a spoiler for part 2 of this course, if we need to suggest something slightly different if white plays h3 without knight f3, there are some move order issues, and we'll be able to probably transpose to that with either knight a6, bishop e3, knight h5, although bishop e3 isn't completely necessary, or knight h5 first, bishop e3, knight a6, or knight h5, g3, knight a6, but once again, bishop e3 is the main move. And all of these would transpose to the next video in part 2. But white can get these positions via the Petrosian move order, but that's not an option. So let's play a5, then we're definitely not going to get move ordered. If white just goes back with bishop e2, which would be a direct transposition here. So once again, white has a few options. g4 is by far the main move played these days. White immediately clamps down on the f5 square. And this is quite thematic of h3. But I think this position is very difficult to play as white. He needs to keep absolute control. If he does allow one of these breaks, he's in a lot of trouble, because let's just ask white a small question of what he intends to do with this king. It's never going to be safe. If he keeps a complete bind on us and we're a bit inaccurate, it might be unpleasant because we won't get any play. But otherwise, I think it's a very risky line to play as white, strategically risky. And so we should be very happy to face it. I know I always am. Other options, white could keep it in a more Petrosian spirit with bishop g5. Knight a6 again, same things. Knight d2 is the only unique plan. If white plays bishop e2, we're back in the Petrosian. g4, we'll get the position with an immediate g4. So say knight d2. Now let's just get out of that pin. We've got our plan. We'll bring the knight round to c5. If white plays either bishop e2, transposing back into the Petrosian, or g4, both moves stop knight h5. If white doesn't play either of those, then we're ready instead to go via h5. So for example, bishop e2, knight d7. Once again, a3 is the move to prevent the knight coming into c5. But now we're just back in our Petrosian line, where we're recommending the pawn sacrifice with f5. So bishop g5 is just very likely to transpose. Now bishop d3 is a completely different idea that's rare, but we should just remember it too. Generally, it looks kind of sensible to play bishop d3, but it's also risky at the same time, because when a knight lands on c5, we'll gain a tempo. White doesn't want to allow the exchange. So it really depends whether white's extra control over f5 is worth it for the lost time. If the bishop goes back, for example, after here, if some plan with g4 and we play our knight round to c5, and the bishop goes back to c2 or b1, then he's got to be really careful about us breaking with a subsequent b5 after c6, cd, because he's lost control there. Instead, castle is the only sort of logical way to make use of bishop d3. But I quite like bishop d7. It's a generally useful move, playing against the plan of a3, because we'll have some a4, and we're still keeping f5 as our main break. For example, bishop g5, h6, bishop back, knight h7, and we're ready with f5, coming very swiftly. We're happy to sacrifice this pawn. If white really wants it, then good luck to him. It's true he's won a pawn, but all he's done is opened up the h file for our attack. He's exchanged off our bad bishop for his good one, and he's lost a lot of time. Knight g5 is coming after the knight exchange, rook h8, and we'll be ready to sacrifice on h3 with a huge attack. So we should just be happy. If white really wants to grab a pawn that was protecting his king, then feel free. So bishop d3 is a rare alternative approach that shouldn't challenge us. g4, controlling the f5 square, is by far the main try. We continue with our normal plan of knight a6, and we're ready to bring our knight round to c5. And white here has a choice. Bishop g5 is a bit different, so we should pay attention. Clearly, we can't go knight d7 here because our queen would be hanging. And if we go queen e8, in practice, this often transposes to our Petrosian variations. But it's a bit risky because white might attack us fast with some rook g1 and h4 and h5 without wasting the tempi. When it gets to just a matter of tempi in these races, when white is attacking us on the king side, I'd prefer not to give him a souped up version with queen e8. So it might be playable, but I would rather not allow rook g1 here. So instead, I'll play bishop d7 and instead play for the c6 break. Once white is committed to g4, then we're not at all worried about c6. White's not going to be able to go back to castle and king side. So his king's just going to get opened up by c6. And knight c5. I think here we're doing completely fine. We're going to just play on the queen side with ideas of cd and b5. White has the typical issues with his king. So bishop e3 is more logical, more natural. But now we can play our normal plan with knight d7. We could also play that plan we just saw with knight c5 and bishop d7 and c6 and a4. But we might as well stay consistent with knight d7. Our plan is knight dc5 and f5. White could start with rook g1, but doesn't change very much. We'll be ready to move our king. And the knight is very well placed on c5. White's only critical move is to play a3 again, this theme we saw before. Now we can't put the knight on c5 because b4 is annoying with our loose rook. We're not in time. So instead we play knight b6. We're ready to play bishop to d7 and angle to play knight a4. For example, rook g1, bishop d7. And yeah, we basically have these two plans here. The principal one is the knight exchange on a4 or improving the knight, bring it round to c5. The secondary one is to play for the f5 break. White goes for it. This plan of rook g1 and h4 is very rare, but it's the only way to try and exploit this move order. In practice, white tends to play knight d2 at some point, and we're just transposed back into a normal position where we're very quick with either plan, king h8 and f5, and getting ready for knight a4. So h4, the forcing move, knight c5. Now we're threatening to exchange a pair of knights with knight ba4. And white has three ways to stop it. Bishop takes c5 is a very drastic way that we're not worried about at all. After dc, it might look like our structure is damaged, but with c6, we're going to improve it. When we take on d5, if white recaptures with the e-pawn, then he's got to be really worried about us going e4, especially as he's giving away the dark square bishop. Our bishop's going to be so strong with white's king stuck either in the center or on the queen side. It'll be a huge attack either way. And if after bishop takes c5, dc, c6, cd, white instead goes cd5, then we've got a plan of going a4, reroute our knight from b6 round to d6 and play b5. And again, our pawns roll and we've got a nice structure. So bishop takes c5 is not a good move. Instead, either white should occupy the a4 square with a4, as they're playing correspondence these days, or play b3, which has been the choice of the top grandmasters in over-the-board play. So we'll check out both. If the immediate a4, we should be quite subtle here. I think we should play the waiting move of queen e7. The reason is that it's not so easy for white to make any more useful waiting moves. With our queen on e7, we're more ready for c6 because we're controlling the d6 pawn. And we're just going to see how white reacts. We want to play for f5 by playing king h8. But the thing is that if we play it immediately, then g5 is an improved version for white than our king being on g8. That's because his plan is to play h5 when he's got some attacking chances down the h-file and also threatening h6, trapping our bishop on g7. So here we'd far prefer our king back on g8. And therefore we might as well start with queen e7 so that the g5 plan doesn't work. If white goes h5 instead, then we can exchange and now play king h8. White's not going for the trapping the bishop approach here, and he can't open the h-file anymore because his own pawn is in the way. There's no pawn on g6 to take. So we're ready to play f5, and white needs to act very quickly or it'll be us taking over in the center, and then even on the king side. For example, if our bishop's kicked, we've got bishop f6 and rook g8, and we're the ones to take the g-file. It's taking white too long to coordinate his queen side. Like rook and a1 isn't involved. So b3 is a human move. And this time I think we might as well just play king h8 immediately. From what I said earlier, g5 is a critical move. White has tried knight d2 But apart from the fact, I think you can take this pawn on h4. If we just play f5, then white's not going to have anything better than g5 anyway, transposing. So g5, but now we're in time to break with f5. Now we're threatening to take on e4, so white tends to defend it. He's also now threatening h5 because he's opened up access for his queen, so we need to defend this square. Bishop e8 is a very interesting way of doing it, but queen e8 looks more straightforward to me. White renews the threat, and we're just in time with fe4. The thing is that we need to watch out for, of course, this h5 plan, and then putting a lot of pressure on that h7 pawn. So we take, and the idea is that our bishop can now be involved. After h5, we'll just take it. Our bishop comes to f5 and sits on g6. A great square where it combines defense of the h7 pawn with control of the e4 square and attacking white's position. In all these positions, if we ever get e4 in, then we're practically winning because white's queenside falls apart. So the pieces get exchanged, and we play bishop f5. We've got a rock-solid kingside now. We don't need to worry about h5 because we'll just take it. White can't move the knight because of e4, and so we're doing completely fine here. This line is very critical and gets a little bit complicated, but it's quite difficult for white as well. He has to navigate very accurate move orders to get any of this challenging position. Normally, white plays more on autopilot with an automatic knight d2, and that doesn't put any pressure on us. We combine this plan of bringing a knight round to a4, just exchanging off our superfluous knight. This is really our main plan. If we can exchange this knight on b6 for the one on c3, white loses a lot of control of the e4 square, and f5 will come even stronger. So combine this plan with playing f5. f5 comes much more powerfully once white's committed to b3 to stop knight a4, because his knight is loose on c3, and so it becomes incredibly dangerous for him to allow e5, e4. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you in the final Quickstarter, same-ish, next. Bye.